91 million people. That is the number the President of the United States just put a face on, standing on the tarmac beside Air Force One, describing exactly what happens to an entire country the moment he decides to give a single order. Take out the power plants, and every one of those 91 million people loses electricity within a day. Take out the bridges, and the roads that move food, fuel, and troops across an entire nation stop functioning within an hour. He did not threaten this in some closed briefing room. He said it out loud in public, on camera, as a warning to a government that has already lost most of what it once had. And then he said something even colder right after it. They know I'm going to do that. Not might, not could. Going to. That is not a threat sitting in reserve anymore. That is a countdown, and Iran knows exactly whose finger is on the clock. Before we even get to the threat itself, there's a second story running underneath it that most coverage has completely missed, and it matters just as much as anything happening over Iranian airspace. For weeks, a narrative has circulated suggesting the United States has burned through so much of its air defense inventory supporting this campaign that it can no longer sustain a broader fight if one becomes necessary. Asked directly aboard Air Force One whether depleted stockpiles were a concern heading into a potentially broader conflict, the president pushed back hard, insisting the country has plenty of ammunition across multiple categories, while acknowledging that a significant amount of the most advanced interceptor systems had been transferred to Ukraine under the previous administration, leaving what he described as empty cupboards when he returned to office. Since then, according to his own account, production has ramped up aggressively, with every major contractor building 4 to 5 new manufacturing plants simultaneously, and Patriot interceptor production specifically identified as a priority. Whether that rebuild is fully complete is a separate question from whether it is underway, and it clearly is. That detail matters enormously for how seriously Tehran should take the threat against the power plants and the bridges, because a country that genuinely believed America's stockpiles were exhausted would have far less reason to come back to the table, asking, as the president put it, please don't drop, don't shoot. But let's back all the way up, because to understand how a president ends up casually discussing the collapse of a nation's entire power grid on the way to a photo op, you need to understand exactly what has been building for the better part of a year. This war traces back to a strike on the 28th of February, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated campaign that killed Iran's supreme leader within its opening hours and set off months of retaliation across the region. What followed was not one continuous war. It was a war interrupted repeatedly by ceasefires that Iran agreed to and then broke. A ceasefire reached in early April collapsed within weeks. A memorandum of understanding signed in June meant to formalize a longer-term halt to hostilities, unraveled within days of being signed, with Iran resuming attacks on commercial shipping almost as soon as the ink dried. Each time, the pattern repeated. Iran signs something on paper, the fighting pauses just long enough for the world to exhale, and then the strikes on shipping resume, the missiles start flying again, and Washington goes right back to where it started. That pattern is exactly why the current round of threats sounds so different from every round that came before it. It also helps to understand that this was never purely an American operation running in isolation. The February campaign was launched jointly with Israel, whose own military ran a parallel operation against the same regime, building directly on a shorter and more contained conflict. The two countries fought against Iran the previous summer, a 12-day war that first put American and Israeli bombs on Iran's Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan nuclear sites. That earlier round was supposed to have settled the nuclear question. It did not, because inspectors were never able to fully verify what happened to Iran's pre-war stockpile of enriched uranium once the strikes ended and the tunnels collapsed. That unresolved uncertainty from a year earlier is the entire reason Pickaxe Mountain carries the weight it does today. It is not a new problem. It is the unfinished half of an old one, and the fact that Iran has spent the months since actively excavating a new facility, specifically engineered to survive the kind of weapon that already hit its predecessor sites, tells you plainly that Tehran never treated the previous round as settled either. The uranium question, sitting underneath all of this, is worth stating in plain numbers, because it is the actual material fact driving every threat described so far. International inspectors had tracked Iran's stockpile of uranium enriched to 60% purity, comfortably close to weapons grade with further enrichment, at a level sufficient for multiple weapons, if ever pushed the rest of the way. A significant share of that material was believed stored in deep tunnels near Isfahan even before this current war began, and the working assumption among analysts tracking the program is that whatever survived the opening strikes in February has since been moved, consolidated, or further buried, quite possibly into the same tunnel network now being expanded at Pickaxe Mountain. The president has said publicly that the target that actually matters to Washington is not the mountain itself, but the material presumed to be inside it, following the uranium, rather than the excavation reports alone. That distinction is the difference between a threat aimed at real estate and a threat aimed at an actual weapons program. and it is why this specific site has drawn a level of attention no other target in this entire war has received. Now let's talk about exactly where things stand today, because the vague version of this story misses what actually makes it dangerous. Speaking from Air Force One, the president confirmed that Iran's own negotiators had requested this meeting following a 13-day American bombing campaign, a campaign that hit missile storage, drone facilities, naval assets, and coastal infrastructure with a level of intensity that finally forced Iran back to a table it had walked away from before. According to reporting from Axios, the president remains ready for what he called strong military action if the current talks collapse, even as he expressed optimism that a deal remains within reach. Separately, Oman has presented Iran with a formal proposal aimed specifically at reopening the Strait of Hormuz to commercial traffic, and in the brief window between the 24th and 26th of the month, roughly 29 vessels managed to pass through that critical waterway, according to international shipping data, a number that sounds small until you remember that for weeks before it, that number was functionally zero. The president's own assessment of what it will take to keep that number climbing was blunt. "You cannot bribe Iran into keeping the strait open," he said. "You have to beat them. Understand exactly what is at stake in that single waterway before going any further, because it explains why 29 vessels in 48 hours is treated as genuinely significant news." The Strait of Hormuz, under normal conditions, carries roughly a fifth of the entire world's daily oil supply, somewhere in the range of 20 million barrels moving through a channel narrow enough that outbound and inbound tanker lanes sit only a few miles apart. That oil belongs not just to Iran, but to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar as well. The overwhelming majority of it ultimately headed toward energy-hungry markets across Asia. When Iran effectively closed that waterway to shipping through mines, missile strikes, and drone attacks earlier in this conflict, the resulting shortage sent global energy prices climbing and briefly triggered exactly the kind of shockwave through supply chains that a choke point of that size is capable of producing. Every vessel that makes it through now is not just a shipping statistic. It is a direct signal of how much control over the world's most important oil corridor has shifted back toward Washington's side of the ledger. And it is precisely why the president tied his ultimatum to Iran directly to keeping that traffic moving, rather than to any single military objective on land. Let's dissect the actual military assessment sitting underneath this pause, because it did not come out of nowhere, and it changes the entire read of what happens next. According to the president's own account, the generals running this campaign told him directly that there was no point in continuing at the current pace, because there were no meaningful targets left to strike. Reporting from Axios independently confirms that account almost word for word. The commander of United States Central Command informed the Pentagon and the White House that 2 weeks of sustained strikes around the Strait of Hormuz had significantly degraded Iran's ability to threaten commercial vessels, and that the designated target list had been mostly exhausted, with roughly 20% of the original objectives from the opening phase of this campaign still standing. Read that again, because that 20% is the entire hinge this story swings on. It means the campaign did not stop because it failed. It stopped because it succeeded at everything short of finishing the job, and finishing the job would require a level of escalation nobody has fully committed to yet. According to the president's own account, it was that same military assessment, paired with a private phone call in which he raised the subject of the bridges and the power plants directly with Iranian negotiators, that may have brought them back to a table that 3 months of broken ceasefires and one collapsed memorandum of understanding never could. Here is where the story gets genuinely strange, and where the difference between what Iran says in public and what it does at the negotiating table becomes impossible to ignore. According to sourcing familiar with the diplomatic channel, Iranian officials have spent months publicly insisting they are not speaking with the United States at all, while simultaneously having negotiators pick up the phone directly to the president, asking him to stop the bombing. Those public denials are not confusion. They are theater, aimed entirely at a domestic audience that needs to believe its government is standing defiant rather than begging for relief. The statements typically come from the foreign ministry spokesperson, engineered for broadcast, while the actual substance of the negotiation moves through a completely separate channel that almost never makes it into Iranian state media. That gap between the public performance and the private request is not a minor detail. It is the single clearest signal available right now of just how much leverage the campaign of the last several weeks has actually generated. Because governments negotiating from strength do not need 2 separate scripts running at the same time. Now for the mountain, because this is the piece of the story that turns an economic threat into something with global stakes attached to it. American and Israeli intelligence have identified an underground facility south of Iran's Natanz enrichment complex, known as Pickaxe Mountain, a site excavated deep beneath solid granite specifically to survive the kind of bombs that already destroyed Iran's above-ground nuclear infrastructure earlier in this conflict. Satellite imagery has shown continued excavation, construction vehicles moving in and out of tunnel entrances, and a newly paved access road, all consistent with the facility being actively hardened rather than abandoned. The president has said publicly and repeatedly that American intelligence is watching that mountain closely, describing it at one point as not a big problem, while in the same breath confirming that if no deal is reached, it will be taken out. That is a president holding two completely different tones about the exact same target within a single sentence. And that contradiction is deliberate. Confidence and threat delivered together are meant to convey exactly one message to Tehran. We already know what is inside that mountain, we already know how to reach it, and the only open question left is whether you give us a reason to. Let's break down what actually reaching a target like that would require, because the hardware conversation here is not hypothetical anymore. The only bomb in the American arsenal capable of reliably defeating a facility buried hundreds of feet under solid granite is the massive ordnance penetrator, a 30,000-pound bunker-busting weapon that can only be carried by the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, the same combination used against Iran's Fordo enrichment site during the 12-day war that preceded this one. Because a single penetrator strike on the deepest tunnel sections may not fully collapse a structure engineered specifically to survive one, military planners have discussed the possibility of stacking strikes, sending a second massive ordnance penetrator into the same impact crater created by the first, using the damage from the initial hit to let the follow-up bomb punch even deeper before detonating. Beyond the air option, there has also been discussion of a ground component, a small special operations element tasked with actually entering the facility after an initial strike to confirm what materials were stored there and secure or destroy anything left intact. A mission that would only be viable because Iran currently has no functioning air force capable of contesting its own airspace, a reality underscored by an earlier incident in which a downed American F-15 pilot was recovered roughly 48 hours after being shot down behind what used to be defended Iranian territory and is now territory Iran can no longer reliably control. The physics behind why a weapon like the massive ordnance penetrator is even necessary here is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains exactly why Pickaxe Mountain has survived every prior round of this conflict untouched. A bomb of that size is designed to punch through hundreds of feet of hardened rock before a delayed fuse triggers detonation deep underground, trapping the explosive force inside the mountain rather than venting it uselessly into open air above the impact point. That is the only way to collapse a facility deliberately excavated beneath solid granite, specifically to defeat conventional airstrikes. It is also why American officials have kept returning to the idea of stacking two penetrators in the same crater, rather than relying on a single strike, because even the largest conventional bomb in the American arsenal cannot guarantee full destruction of a target engineered from the outset with exactly this weapon in mind. Iran built that mountain to survive an attack of this scale. Whether it actually does is now a question of tunnel depth, rock density, and how many of those 30,000-pound weapons Washington is willing to commit to finding out. So, what does the actual operational picture look like once you strip away the rhetoric and look at hard numbers? 13 consecutive days of American strikes preceded this pause, hitting missile storage, coastal defense sites, and naval infrastructure with enough intensity that CENTCOM's own commander assessed the available target list as mostly exhausted. 20% of the original objectives from the opening phase of this campaign remain unstruck, sitting there as the explicit next step if talks collapse. 29 commercial vessels transited the Strait of Hormuz in a single recent 48-hour window. A small number in absolute terms, but a meaningful signal given how close to zero that traffic had fallen during the worst weeks of the blockade. Oil prices dropped sharply the same day these talks were confirmed, and stock markets moved up noticeably within the same news cycle, both reacting in real time to the possibility that the most dangerous choke point in global energy markets might actually stay open. Every one of those figures tells the same underlying story from a different angle. Iran's capacity to project force, whether against shipping, against American positions, or against its own neighbors, has been reduced to a fraction of what it was in February. And the numbers on the diplomatic side are only moving in one direction because of it. That brings us to the three simultaneous pressure tracks converging on Tehran at this exact moment, because none of them are separable from the other two. The third track is psychological, built almost entirely around Pickaxe Mountain, a threat aimed directly at the one capability Iran's leadership has spent years trying to protect above everything else, its path toward an actual nuclear weapon. Squeeze any one of those tracks in isolation, and a regime like this one has proven, across decades of sanctions and prior conflicts, that it can absorb the pain and simply wait out the pressure. Running all three simultaneously with an explicit deadline attached, and a second head of state in the form of Israel's prime minister, publicly aligned with the American position, removes the option of simply waiting this one out. What makes this convergence different from every prior round of pressure applied to Iran over the past 2 decades is the sequencing, not just the scale. Sanctions alone, going back to well before this war even started, gave Tehran years to build workarounds, gray market oil sales, barter arrangements, and financial channels routed through friendly governments. A military campaign alone, even one as intense as the strikes carried out over the past several months, gives a regime time to disperse assets, harden remaining sites, and wait for domestic political pressure inside the United States to build against a prolonged conflict. But military pressure that specifically degrades the ability to earn money from oil exports, layered directly on top of financial sanctions that were already choking off alternative revenue, closes off the two paths a sanctioned state normally uses to survive at the exact same time. Add the explicit threat to the power grid and the road network, the actual physical infrastructure a modern economy needs to function day to day, and you have removed every fallback option in sequence rather than letting Iran address them one at a time. That sequencing is not an accident. It is the structure of the entire campaign. Now let's go inside the actual negotiating apparatus on the Iranian side, because the formal chain of command and the operational reality making decisions are not the same thing, and that gap is exactly what keeps collapsing every agreement Iran has signed so far. The public-facing negotiators include figures like Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, both of whom represent the relatively more pragmatic wing of the government, the wing capable of sitting across a table and sounding reasonable. But behind that wing sits a separate power center inside the Revolutionary Guard, officials with an institutional interest in continuing the fight rather than ending it, reportedly pushing for continued control over the Strait of Hormuz, even as the diplomatic track publicly commits to reopening it. That structural split is precisely why a memorandum of understanding signed by Iran's own president unraveled within days rather than weeks. It was not that the signature was fake. It was that the signature belonged to one wing of a government that does not fully control the wing capable of overriding it. Every time Iranian state media broadcasts defiant rhetoric or releases the kind of hostile propaganda aimed at the American president and his family that surfaced again this week, that messaging is coming from the same faction, with the institutional incentive to sabotage whatever the pragmatists just agreed to. That propaganda video deserves its own moment of scrutiny, because the timing of it tells you everything about which faction inside Tehran is actually driving events on any given day. A government that is genuinely, seriously pursuing a negotiated deal does not simultaneously authorize state media to release threatening material aimed at the head of state sitting across the table from its own negotiators. Those two actions cancel each other out in any rational read of good faith diplomacy, which is exactly the point. It is not a mistake or miscommunication. It is a domestic audience play, a way for hardliners inside the security establishment to reassure their own base that nothing has been surrendered, even while their own foreign ministry is quietly working the phones for relief. The same logic explains the missile strikes Iran has continued launching at neighboring Gulf states it claims as informal allies. Attacking a neighbor while simultaneously seeking a deal only makes sense if the goal is to manufacture leverage by making other countries pressure Washington to back off, a strategy that has instead left Iran more isolated from those same neighbors than at almost any point in recent memory. So what is the honest, strategic assessment sitting underneath everything described so far? On one side, Iran has been reduced to negotiating through back channels while publicly denying it is negotiating at all. Its economy strangled by a blockade that has cut oil exports to a trickle, its military stripped of the ability to contest its own airspace and its most protected remaining asset, an unfinished nuclear facility buried under a mountain, now sitting explicitly on a target list that could be activated within days of a failed deal. On the other side, the president has been careful to frame every threat as conditional rather than committed, repeating the same structure in nearly every public statement this week. Make a deal, and none of this happens. Don't make a deal, and we go back to exactly what we were doing before, except worse. That framing matters because it keeps the off-ramp open for both governments simultaneously, giving Iran's pragmatic negotiators something they can actually sell to hardliners back home without looking like total capitulation, while giving Washington a publicly stated justification for far more aggressive action if the talks collapse. The next several days are less about whether new fighting breaks out and more about whether Iran's internal power struggle between its negotiators and its Revolutionary Guard resolves in time to actually hold whatever gets signed this time, given that the last two agreements did not survive contact with that same internal division. Watch specifically for whether the Supreme National Security Council issues any public statement in the coming days, because that single signal will tell you more than any press conference from either government. Silence from that body while negotiators continue talking generally means the process still has room to move forward. A public statement reasserting Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz or reaffirming continued work at Pickaxe Mountain regardless of American threats would be the clearest possible sign that the hardline faction has decided to reassert itself before any agreement can be finalized, exactly the pattern that killed the April ceasefire and the June memorandum before it. That is the actual signal worth watching, not the daily rhetoric from either president, because rhetoric has proven unreliable on both sides of this conflict for the better part of a year. One more indicator worth tracking alongside it is the pace of shipping traffic through the strait itself. 29 vessels in 48 hours was treated as meaningful progress precisely because the baseline had fallen so low. If that number keeps climbing steadily over the coming days, it suggests the Oman-mediated framework is holding in practice, not just on paper. If it stalls or reverses, that is very likely to happen before any formal announcement from either government, because insurers and shipping companies react to real conditions on the water long before diplomats issue a statement confirming what already happened. Weigh that against the counter-argument some analysts are already raising, because a fair assessment has to account for it. It is possible that continued escalation, rather than continued patience, carries its own serious risk. A strike on Pickaxe Mountain that fails to fully destroy what is buried inside it would confirm the facility's survivability rather than end the threat, potentially pushing Iran's remaining enriched material further underground and further out of reach of future inspection. A strike on the power grid, even framed narrowly as retaliation for specific attacks on shipping, would fall overwhelmingly on the same 91 million civilians who have already endured months of economic strangulation, a humanitarian cost that would almost certainly draw international condemnation regardless of how carefully Washington frames the justification. Serious people disagree about whether the threat of that kind of escalation is more likely to produce a durable deal or simply accelerate the next cycle of retaliation. What both sides of that argument agree on is that the coming days matter more than almost any other stretch of this entire year-long conflict, because for the first time, every available lever, military, economic, and now infrastructural, is sitting on the table at once. There is also a domestic political dimension to this that rarely makes it into the coverage, but shapes every decision coming out of the White House right now. A president who can point to falling oil prices, a rising stock market, and a war that appears to be ending on favorable terms has an enormous amount of room to be patient. A president facing the opposite, rising energy costs and a conflict with no visible endpoint, faces enormous pressure to escalate quickly regardless of the military logic involved. Right now, every economic indicator tied to this conflict is moving in the direction that rewards patience, which is exactly why the threats against Pickaxe Mountain and the power grid are being delivered as conditional warnings rather than active orders. That could change quickly if Iran's internal politics produce another broken agreement, but as of this moment, time is a resource Washington can afford to spend and Tehran cannot. And here is the structural risk that should concern you more than any single headline coming out of this week, because it is the one variable that has already broken this process twice before. Even in the best-case scenario, where Ghalibaf and Arakchi negotiate something that genuinely addresses shipping through the Strait of Hormuz and opens a real conversation about the nuclear program, that agreement still has to survive contact with an Islamic Revolutionary Guard leadership that has demonstrated twice now a willingness to override its own government's signature within days when the terms do not suit its institutional interests. A government whose own negotiators cannot guarantee that a deal will outlast the ink drying on the page is not a government capable of offering the kind of verifiable, durable agreement Washington has explicitly said it requires this time. That is the exact reason the president has kept the threat against the power plants, the bridges, and Pickaxe Mountain sitting fully loaded, rather than putting it away in exchange for talks alone. Words on paper have already failed twice. What remains untested is whether the threat of an entire country losing power and mobility within 24 hours is finally severe enough to keep the Revolutionary Guard's faction from doing what it has done every single time before. Layer one more complication on top of that internal split, because it explains why even a successful negotiation carries real risk of falling apart after the fact rather than during the talks themselves. Iran's Supreme National Security Council, the body that formally sits above both the diplomatic and military tracks, has its own institutional interests, separate from either the negotiators at the table or the field commanders running proxy operations across the region. That council has to approve any final agreement before it can take effect, which means the deal Ghalibaf and Arakchi negotiate in the coming days is not actually final the moment they shake hands. It still has to clear a body stacked with figures who were directly involved in ordering the security crackdown against Iran's own protesters earlier this year, Individuals with every incentive to view any concession to Washington as a sign of weakness that could embolden the next round of domestic unrest. A regime that spent months suppressing its own population by force is not a regime that finds it easy to simultaneously project strength at home while accepting real limits abroad, and that contradiction sits at the center of every single agreement Iran has failed to honor so far. Which brings this back to where it started, on a tarmac, with a number attached to it. 91 million people, one sentence away from losing power. An entire road and bridge network 1 hour away from collapse. A mountain outside Natanz that the world's most sophisticated satellite systems are already watching in real time, waiting to see whether the excavation inside it stops or continues. Iran's negotiators are on the phone asking for talks while its state media keeps broadcasting defiance for the cameras. Its Revolutionary Guard is reportedly pushing to keep control of the one waterway. Its own diplomats claim they are willing to reopen. And the president who described all of this so plainly on his way to a photo op has made one thing unmistakably clear. The bombs have already proven what they can do to Iran's coastline. The next decision on the table is not about whether the country's military can survive another round. It is about whether 91 million ordinary people are about to find out exactly how far a president is willing to go once the talking stops, and whether the men actually holding power inside Tehran's security apparatus are willing to let their own negotiators stop it before that happens.